debating what I should talk to you all about, and looking at the theme of the conference, and then the fact that we are here as part of the representation of India in the US, working to consolidate relations between India and US as we would see it to India's advantage. And many of you are also involved in some way bridging this distance between India and the United States. I thought the best would be for me to speak to you briefly, the opportunity for people like you. Many of you are from India or have some India relationship or linkage and are getting a bit of the US experience. Now, when policymakers in India look at how we want to see the country evolve, clearly the first priority is to see how we can transform the high rates of growth we've had now for some time, despite the challenges, despite some slowdown of late. And there are several references to that high rate of growth. How do we transform that into inclusive growth for the benefit of a larger mass of people, for the development of rural areas, to ensure better access to education, healthcare? And as we do that, how do we ensure, because that would also be a very important part of this process, a broadly peaceful environment for India, not just in its immediate neighborhood, but in the wider region and in the global context. So we approach our relationship with the US essentially in that framework. And looking at that context, those who start looking at statistics will find that the India-US relationship has evolved tremendously over the last decade or so. Trade has grown 4 times in the last 8 years. It now stands at about $100 billion. For India, US is our largest trading partner. For the US, of course, India ranks lower down because the US has much wider trade engagements with other countries. But there are 2 very interesting aspects in this overall trade pattern. One, trade in services, which is about $40 billion, is in US favor, the balance, despite all the noise that you hear about so-called outsourcing. And I say so-called outsourcing because eventually trade is based on comparative advantage, be it advantage in terms of prices of capital, goods, or labor, or skilled workers. So even there, the trade in services is in US favor. And the other aspect is that it is a broadly balanced trade relationship. So the kind of problems that the US has in its relationship with some other countries, you don't find that in the US-India trade relationship. Going beyond that, when I look at investments, US remains among the largest foreign investors in India, and foreign investment is important for India. You would have seen that our finance minister said recently that foreign investment in India, foreign investment flows are an imperative for India as we deal with our development challenges. But the new development is that in the last 5 years, India has emerged as among the fastest growing foreign investors in the US economy. In the last 5 years, Indian companies have invested about $30 billion in US economy, creating more than 100,000 jobs directly in more than 40 states, and of course several more hundreds of thousands of jobs through the indirect job creation impact. Going beyond the civilian trade and investment dimension, if you look at the defense partnership, US has not been a traditional supplier of defense products to India. However, in the last 4 years, India has placed orders worth about $9 billion on US defense supplies, again a reflection of a new paradigm for the relationship. Among the largest bilateral military exercises India does with any country, it is with the United States. Among the largest bilateral military exercises the US does with any country outside the framework of multilateral structures like NATO, for instance, it is with India. And again, a defining feature of the relationship is the people-to-people dimension. For India, among the strongest links we have with any country at the census, we had about 1.8 million Indian Americans in this country. In the 2010 census, the figure was about 2.8 million. And now the estimates are of about 3 million. Now, it's a significant community spread across many states here, and they have links also with India, families, business links. And there are many figures within this that are also very interesting. There are 60,000 Indian doctors in the US serving in remote parts of this country, providing very important service where methods, services are sometimes not so easily available. 40% of all hotel rooms in the United States are owned, operated, or managed by Indian Americans. And the figure is 60% if you look at the middle and lower segment, but 40% overall. We have 100,000 Indian students in US universities. And some of you, I suppose, fall in this category. And I'm not talking about Indian American students. These are Indian students who come from India. For these people, the government and people of India are paying $3 billion annually as tuition fees to US educational institutions. And I'm not just conjuring it out of thin air. 100,000, you multiply that 30,000. I'm sure people here pay more, those who are not on scholarships. And you get a figure of $3 billion. And that's what you find in trade statistics in the services sector, in the trade between the two countries. So again, reflecting the very strong level of the interaction. What I have described for you suggests the natural areas of cooperation that will then follow for the relationship. One of the very important areas is cooperation in energy sector. Now, in India, as you know, we are heavily dependent on imported energy, which leads to huge subsidies, and we are heavily dependent on fossil fuels. As India grows, the demand for energy will grow. And not only because of the high growth rates, but even today, almost 400 million people in India do not have access to commercial energy. And therefore, if we are talking of inclusive growth, and generating this access to commercial energy to a much wider set of people would be a very important element. Therefore, as we go ahead, we have to move beyond the traditional sources of fuel and energy. And therefore, partnership for renewable energy is an important area of partnership with the United States. So we have set up between the two countries something called the PACE program, Partnership for Clean Energy. Under this program, we have set up a joint clean energy research center funded by $15 million contribution by both governments and encouraging private sector contribution. From this fund, the first award of projects has been done for 3 projects where you have an Indian institution and US institution coming together to bid jointly for a project to develop technology. And the 3 projects in the first funding have been in solar, second generation biofuels, and in energy efficiency of buildings. And now we have to see how they take this process forward. India has also shown interest in getting shale gas from the United States, where at the moment there are some restrictions on how much US can supply to countries with which it does not have a free trade agreement. So I put it to you that many of you, if you work in business areas, financial models, business models, or in terms of public policy, should look at the issue of in terms of partnerships for renewable energy, non-conventional energy sources. What can be done to enhance the level of cooperation and its impact? The second area I would suggest is education. I've spoken about the large number of Indian students in universities here. We're looking at 100,000. There are about 100,000 in Australia, 30,000 in UK, 30,000 in Canada. So far, only about 13% of Indians have access to higher education. The government of India wants to take this figure to 25 to 30% in a very short time frame. To do this, we will need to build hundreds of new universities, tens of thousands of new colleges. As we deal with this exercise, partnership with US universities, US institutions would be an important area, be it in terms of faculty development, be it in terms of joint curricular development, be in terms of collaboration between institutions. So again, this is an area I would suggest for all of you to look at. How can you build more cooperation of this nature? And I'm not talking only about universities, but also vocational education. In India, for instance, vocational education has not been so strong so far, but people in India, educators are looking at the community college model in the US. How can that be adapted to meet India's requirement? And recently there was a major conference in India on development of vocational training, community colleges, and they had people, including from the US there. For instance, they have identified the automobile sector and the hospitality sector in India, where there could be profitable investment in developing skill development, skill formation training through vocational colleges, community colleges, or ITIs that we have in India. So this again is just one kind of example of what can be done. So these again would be some of the areas for people like you to look at. Then let me briefly mention the whole approach of innovation. If India is to meet its development challenges, innovation will have to be a critical area of focus. Because innovation is not just a wealth creator, but it has also to be done in a way that society benefits and the wider mass of people can take advantage. And we've seen the impact. There was a reference in the earlier panel, for example, to mobile telephones. And you can see the way the use of mobile telephones have simply transformed the landscape in India in many ways. Be it the vegetable seller who comes to your house and leaves now a visiting card with his mobile telephone listed there, so you can call him and tell him exactly which vegetables you want at what point of time. Or the farmer who is now able to use the mobile telephone to get some information about prices in neighboring markets. Or the dairy supplier who is able to get similar information. Or people who go out to vote are able to use text to get information, detailed information about candidates in certain areas. So with more than almost 1 billion mobile phones now available, based on a leapfrogging of technology, because all of you are aware of the challenge we had in spreading the use of landline telephones. But new technology, leapfrogging of technology, enabled us to do something which benefited a much wider cross-section of people. So how do we bring in new innovation that sort of transcends the challenges that we face in India in terms of infrastructure, and yet enables us to reach out to much wider cross-section of people? This again is an area where, as all of you I'm sure know, that Indians are doing a lot of work in the US. In the Silicon Valley, there's a huge presence of Indian origin people. At all our universities and various institutes of technology in the US, again, you find presence of innovators, entrepreneurs. Many US companies have a presence in India doing R&D and development work. GE, for example, has 6,000 people in India doing just R&D and development work. And they developed through that a low-cost mobile ECG platform, which then they have used to market in other countries in the world. Because certain amount of cost-effective R&D and development work is happening in India in a niche way. And that, again, is an opportunity for further exploitation. Science and technology. So if we want to look at future development, growth, development in basic science and technology, would need to provide the basis on which we can move forward in several areas. And the two governments have come together to set up a $30 million fund to support joint projects in science and technology between US and Indian institutions. And in the first award of projects, 3 projects have been awarded in the area of healthy individual and bridging the digital divide. So here, for example, they have come together to try and develop projects under which the farmer can be enabled access to the cold chain technology, or, for example, some kind of a vibrator technology which would enable people with Parkinson's disease to move in a better way. So these are some of the examples of how we are encouraging institutions in both countries to come together and come out with a new process or a new product. Let me mention just one more area before I stop my main presentation is agriculture. Because agriculture remains vital for India. Today, only about 14% of our GDP comes from agriculture, but almost 60% of our workforce is still employed in agriculture. In many areas of agricultural production, including dairy, and we have somebody here from Arun, India is the highest in terms of the volume of production, but if you look at productivity, we rank very low. So if we are looking to the future, if we are looking at reducing the heavy dependence on agriculture, because of which the farm size tends to be very small, then increasing agricultural productivity, generating manufacturing capacity, enable people to move away from agriculture to alternative employment opportunities would be a very important area. And perhaps those of you who are very young would have forgotten that in the 1960s, there was this whole experience of recurrent famines in India, people dying of malnutrition, hunger, lack of availability of sufficient food. You don't hear that anymore. And we have more than 50 million tons of stocks of food grains. All this was initially enabled through the green revolution that happened in the late 60s through the use of high-yielding variety seeds. And that green revolution was done on the basis of partnership between Indian and American scientists. Norman Borlaug from the US had made a very major contribution to that. So now we are looking at trying to do another green revolution, second green revolution, or as the US President had once said, an evergreen revolution as an important area of a partnership between India and the US. And this again, I would suggest, is an area for many of you to look at, not just in terms of technology or science, but in terms of management practices, in terms of public policy issues that can enable such transformation to take place. In conclusion, therefore, let me just quote what our Prime Minister had said in a recent message to the US President. And I quote, "I have no doubt that there is much more we can do together to further strengthen the India-US partnership and thereby advance peace and stability, expand mutual economic opportunities, harness the potential of science and technology, innovation and higher education, and empower our people to address global challenges." So that's the context in which we approach the relationships, and that's the context in which I think all of you should attempt to make a contribution as you move on from what you are doing now to dealing with other challenges in life. Thank you very much.
Mr. Singh, my name is Sam Roy. I'm the co-founder of Promethean Power. And there is a remarkable program that was developed about a year ago called the Indo-US Science and Technology Forum. And we're the first recipient of that $500,000 grant that enabled us, a US company, to form a joint venture with an Indian firm that has really helped catapult our thermal battery technology, which is basically a solar power refrigeration system for rural India. And it's such a real example of some of the things that you were talking about that is an enabler on the ground in India. Are there other programs like that that will help in a similar way?
Sure, and I think what I spoke to you about the Science and Technology Endowment Fund that has been set up, which is really built on the initial program that was done through the India-US Science and Technology Forum. So we want to build on that, we want to expand it, so now it has an overall contribution as a start of $30 million. We've done the first award of projects to 3 projects, and a second award of projects will soon be announced. So it's going to be a regular feature. So you should look at more opportunities.
Thanks for your comments. My question is along the same lines. For technologies that are trying to transfer out of US universities or companies into India, and especially in the renewable energy sector, apart from financial, all these companies are looking for Indian partners to work with. That's what really allows them to go there. Is there anything that the embassy or any other institution is doing to enable those partnerships?
Sure. So first I would say I think there is a lot of information now out there. And I find many people in the US are able to get that information and have very good information about the kind of partners they can find in India. But those who would like the support in addition of the embassy or the government are welcome to do that. They should really write to us, giving details of the areas they are interested in. And then we will approach the relevant institutions in the government in India and encourage them to give a response to provide more information. And we certainly work to bring together the initial contact. And after that, of course, the partners have to take it forward from there. So if you're interested, just put it together, send me an email.
Respected sir, as you spoke about education, and it's such an important deal in the India-US relationship, what's the progress of American universities entering India and investing in our country? And what are the barriers that some of these colleges face when they enter India?
All right. So at one level, there's a lot of collaboration already going on. And so there are collaborations between US universities, Indian universities, there are issues related to faculty training, some people go for semester exchange programs, so all that is going on. I think the issue you raised was one, whether US universities can set up campuses in India. This is still being debated in India, and there is a bill that is being considered by Parliament, and once Parliament has looked at it, then depending on the eventual form which comes out of it. But I must say that there are several schools of thought in this. Some say that yes, it would be very useful to set up US campuses there. Others raise the question about the level of fees that would be charged, whether that level of fees is sustainable in India. Now, one of your previous speakers, Mr. Alexander, and I studied at the same college in Delhi, which happens to be one of the better liberal arts colleges there. When I studied, I paid the equivalent of 50 US cents per month as tuition fees. Now, a US campus would not quite charge the same level of fees. So then it becomes a challenge. How do you... And a lot of people say that it's a mutual process. It's not just that there's a one-way flow of technology or delivery of education from the US to India. There's a lot of work being done in India on low-cost delivery of education. And perhaps as US now deals with the challenge of high cost of education, debt for the students, the experience we have in India, low cost delivery of education, how can that be used in the context? These are things that people are looking at and debating. Or for example, what you hear now about the massive open online courses, where Harvard, MIT, all of them are also doing a lot of work. How can that be used to spread education in India? And I think some of you should take that on as a challenge. That how can you bring about a contribution through use of massive open online course programs here to generate wider outreach and impact in India. So yes, this is something we are working on, but the whole effort is a collaborative process through which we can all benefit to our mutual advantage.
According to you, what are some of the recent US policy initiatives towards realizing the goal that maybe Prime Minister Arun Singh mentioned, which you stated?
Look, I would say that I'm not looking at a US initiative, I'm looking at an Indian initiative. Ultimately, what we want in India should be generated through the initiatives we take. And then based on the initiative we take, then the question is, how do we see the relevant partnership that the US can provide there? And so I mentioned to you several. Education is one area where we're doing partnership. Even in education, we have set up something called the Singh Obama Knowledge Initiative. And there's a funding provided by both governments of $10 million, under which, under the first award, 8 universities on both sides, so you need a US university or institution and a matching university or institution on the Indian side, have been awarded for developing joint projects in the area of education. So that's clearly something that's happening that we need to take it forward. Mentioned to you what we are doing in renewable energy, science and technology. So I think across the spectrum, the whole attempt is to identify areas that will be of benefit to us and then see how we can, to advantage, partner with this.
Thank you for your insights. I had a different question on the consular services.
Can you come with it?
Yeah. Basically, we we work with a lot of students from the academia back home in India for various activities. For the last couple of years, we've been having issues getting Indian visas for those students. And visas are being rejected because of this $25,000 salary limit. So I just wanted to get your perspective and how this problem could be addressed? Thank you.
At a time after 2008, when the economic crisis had impacted here, and at that time India was still growing at 8%, 9%, and we found a lot of people who had tourist visas were using those visas to start working in India. So this was a challenge we had to deal with. So there is a norm that those who want to do employment in India, there should be a minimum salary on the contract of $25,000. But these are for people who want to do work. Other than that, we certainly encourage interaction and exchanges between the two countries.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is, to be brutally honest, India-American partnership has never been really equitable partnership because of the power structure we share. How do you think India, as going forward, will reconcile what our interests are against what American interests might be when it comes to agriculture and genetically modified seeds, whether it's healthcare sector and a more liberal patent regime when it comes to medicine, which America would want to see and we wouldn't, or if it's in nuclear power safety? There's a tension there, and how do you see India sort of getting best out of it and for our own people moving forward?
No, at one level, all relationships have a power dynamic. And even relationships within families have a power dynamic. So that will always be there. But you will hear clearly articulated at all levels in India that all our decisions will be based on the strategic autonomy of decision making for us. And that is something we reiterate upfront consistently, and that is something we strive to maintain. So clearly, there are challenges that one would face in evolving areas of cooperation, but we have to work hard to ensure that our interests are protected. And I hear from you one thing suggesting as if we have not been so forceful, but I can tell you, and my colleague from State Department is here, that what I hear from them or from the US businesses is that we are being too strong in protecting the Indian interests and too forceful. So maybe I think we are doing something broadly on balance.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for also inspiring Indian Americans, because I think India is one of those countries that does a really good job of making sure that we know where our heritage is, even though we may be right now of a different nationality. In 2009, we had the Right to Education Act in India. And many times when we speak about education, we focus on higher ed. But we will have almost 300 million K through 12 Indians going for education. How has the government supported the infrastructure, the teacher development, and the school principal development for those students?
Thank you. I think it's a very important question. And one reason why I focused on higher education is because of the nature of the audience here. But clearly, primary education, secondary education are all vital areas for investment in India. And people cannot reach higher levels of education without going through that process. And the government, because the Right to Education Act, that was the whole purpose behind that, to try and ensure. So yes, as effort is being made to provide necessary resources for that. But we have a resource challenge, as all societies do, particularly developing societies. Clearly there is an understanding in India that if we want to take India further down the path of development and spread the benefits through inclusive growth, education will be a very important mechanism for economic and social empowerment, and it has to be used in that context. Therefore, investment in primary and secondary education will remain very important. Are we doing all right for time? Yes. All right.
Thank you so much for your lecture, sir. My question is in a slightly different direction. You highlighted a couple of parts of our relationship that include trade, and especially the military, trade that's been happening recently, and that's really grown in the last couple of years. My question to you is to what extent do you see that our growth in this area, trade is not a zero-sum game, but the exercise that are happening in military law, to some extent they come at the expense of our relationships with probably a country like China, which looks at it as probably a hedge against that. To the extent that, how do you see the future of India relations, if they're growing so strongly, it comes at the expense of our relationships with other countries, which we would require to stay with India for?
No, I think our broad approach is first to work for peace and stability in our neighborhood and the wider expanse of the region around that. And then beyond that, to build relationships of So that has been our attempt. And build those relationships of cooperation with all major powers to maximize India's national security interests. So I think that's the framework. So this is the last question.
I'd like to go last.
Please.
Wonderful to see you again. My concern has been in education particularly, and I think it should be taken seriously. First thing is I realize that education at the primary level is so lacking, and I work in the field, I support one laptop per child foundation in India, that it's like creating a nation and trying to create castles of excellence in higher education on the bamboo scaffoldings of primary education. It really is not something where you will send your child to 95% schools. And we missed out on that opportunity. And the previous minister, and even this good friend of mine, Arun, he is not listening to that. Point is, how do you strengthen the primary school? And you have to think in terms of looking ahead rather than the rear view approach that we have taken. How do you think you can help India think ahead?
Well, first let me say that I can obviously not associate myself with any of the comments you made about any particular personalities. But look, I think there is a recognition in India that there has to be an investment in this area. But we have resource constraints and challenges. There are so many different options on which and alternatives on which these resources have to be provided. But as we grow, as our resource availability improves, I think we'll be able to address more of the challenges more effectively. But I can see from all that we get, from all the guidance we get, the messages we receive for follow-up in other areas, there is a recognition of the importance and a focus on this area of activity. Thank you very much, and as I said,